It all started in the small, quiet town of Briar Creek, Texas. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where life moved at a steady pace, and the biggest concern for most people was whether or not the crops were going to survive another hot summer. Brier Creek was a town where neighbors helped each other, and things like crime, accidents, or anything that disrupted the peace were rare. The town was isolated enough that the outside world felt like a distant reality. People lived simple lives, and there was a sense of security that came with that simplicity. No one in Brier Creek ever imagined that something could happen that would change everything. It was an ordinary Tuesday when the first signs appeared. John, a mechanic who had spent his entire life in Brier Creek, had just finished a long day at the garage and was walking home. His mind was still on the work he had done, thinking about the engine he had fixed for Mrs. Reed, when he noticed something strange. At first, it was just a noise, a faint, unsettling groan coming from one of the alleyways. John, being a practical man, shrugged it off. Maybe it was just some kid fooling around. But as he walked closer, he saw a figure stumbling toward him. It was a woman, maybe in her early 40s, but it was hard to tell. Her clothes were ragged, her face pale, and her eyes were wide open, locked in a state of terror. There was something in the way she moved, though that didn't sit right with John. She wasn't walking like a person who was simply tired or sick. It was almost as if she was dragging her own body forward, struggling to stay on her feet. As John stopped and watched her, confused, he realized something else. The woman was covered in blood. But the blood wasn't hers. It was splattered all over her, soaking her clothes, dripping down her arms. John's first instinct was to check if she was okay, to ask if she needed help. But something about the sight of her vacant eyes, and the grotesque amount of blood sent a chill down his spine. "Are you all right?" John called out, his voice steady despite the unease creeping in. The woman didn't respond. She didn't even seem to notice him standing there. Instead, she kept stumbling forward, her body jerking unnaturally with each step. It was only then that John realized the blood wasn't the only thing off about her. Her skin had a sickly, almost grayish tone to it. Her hands, once holding her torn bag, were now reaching out in an unnatural way, as if to grab something or someone. John's heart raced. As he stood frozen in place, unable to take his eyes off her, the woman suddenly stopped. She looked directly at him, and in that moment, John's gut twisted with dread. Her eyes, once wide with terror, were now glazed over, devoid of any human emotion. There was no recognition, no empathy, just hunger. And then she lunged at him. Before John could even react, the woman was on him, her cold hands grabbing his arm with a strength that no person should have. She pulled him closer, and then she lunged at him, her mouth opening wide, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp for a normal human. "God!" John shouted, trying to push her away, but she was relentless. The woman's grip tightened. In a panic, John shoved her off with all the strength he had left, stumbling backward into the street. His heart pounded in his chest as he scrambled to his feet. But as he did, the woman stood up too. The way she moved, it wasn't human. It was as if she was being controlled by something else, her body jerking and twitching unnaturally. John barely had time to think. He ran. His legs moved faster than they ever had before, pushing himself to his limits. As he bolted for home, his mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. What the hell was that? As he reached his house, John slammed the door shut behind him, locking it quickly. His breath came in ragged gasps as he backed away from the door, his eyes wide with fear. The house felt too small, too quiet. His mind replayed the woman's face, those eyes, that savage hunger. He couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was coming. John knew one thing for sure. This wasn't a normal attack. This wasn't a random act of violence. The woman didn't just bite him. It was as if she was driven by something else, something primal. He felt a sharp pain on his shoulder, and when he looked down, he saw the wound she had left behind. It was deep, jagged, but what disturbed him the most wasn't the pain. It was the feeling of something spreading inside him. A chill that he couldn't shake, like the virus was already taking root inside his body. He locked the door, closed the blinds, and sat in his living room, trying to make sense of everything. Was this some kind of flu? A new strain of infection? But that didn't explain what he had seen. That woman, her eyes, she wasn't sick. She was something else entirely. The hours passed slowly, the sounds of the outside world eerily silent. John didn't dare look out the window. The feeling of dread kept crawling up his spine, making him second-guess every noise he heard. Was it the wind, or something else? As night fell, John couldn't stay still any longer. He knew what he had to do. He grabbed his rifle and checked the ammo. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He walked back to the door, peering through the blinds. But nothing, no one. The streets were empty, eerily quiet. But he knew this wasn't the end. Deep down, he knew it was only the beginning. And as the night dragged on, John realized that the world he knew, the peaceful, simple life of Briar Creek, was gone. Something far worse was on the horizon. The worst part? He wasn't sure if there was anything he could do to stop it. John sat back in the chair, the rifle resting on his lap, his mind spinning. He had heard of things like this before, stories of strange outbreaks, but never in a town like Briar Creek. It was too isolated, too quiet for something so catastrophic to happen here. Yet, here he was, locked in his house, waiting for what came next. It would be too late. He couldn't escape this. None of them could. And that thought was enough to send chills down his spine. The next morning, John woke up to a silence that felt unnatural. The world outside his window looked calm, like any other morning in Briar Creek. The sky was gray, with the weight of an early autumn fog, and the quiet hum of the town's usual routine seemed to be holding on, just barely. He thought for a moment that maybe the madness he had witnessed the night before had been some kind of nightmare, but the pain in his shoulder, a deep, gnawing ache, told him otherwise. John hadn't gone to sleep. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, all he could see was the woman's face, twisted with hunger, her hands reaching for him with terrifying strength. The bite on his shoulder felt like it was burning through his skin, and with each passing minute, the anxiety in his chest grew. But even worse than the fear of his own injury was the gnawing uncertainty about what was happening to the town he loved. He grabbed his rifle again, his fingers trembling as he checked the ammo. If things were getting worse, he had to be ready. He'd been trained to fix cars, not to fight for his life. But this wasn't the kind of problem that could be solved with tools. John wasn't sure what he was fighting or who, but he knew one thing. The world around him was changing, and fast. By mid-morning, the first signs of chaos began to surface. John stepped outside cautiously, rifle in hand, looking around his yard, half expecting someone, anything, to jump out at him. He knew that the infection had to be spreading. The woman from the previous night hadn't been an isolated incident. As he walked down the street, he saw the unmistakable signs. Bodies lying in the road, not just dead, but twisted in unnatural positions, some still twitching. John's stomach turned as he stepped over the bodies, keeping his rifle close. There was no sign of anyone alive, no footsteps to be heard, no cries for help, only silence and the distant sound of something shuffling through the streets. It was the kind of silence that made his skin crawl. He was used to hearing the sounds of the town. Dogs barking, kids playing, the occasional car driving by. But now, there was nothing, not even a breeze. As John walked deeper into the town, he began to see more of the people he had known for years, though they looked nothing like the familiar faces he remembered. They weren't sick. No, this was something worse. The townspeople were stumbling through the streets, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes whose strings had been cut. Their eyes were wide open, but there was no recognition behind them. It was like they were gone, and whatever remained was just a shell, a thing that had once been human. John saw a man he recognized, a farmer, someone he'd worked with before, walk by, dragging his leg. his mouth open in a grotesque, slack-jawed expression. Blood smeared his face, but it wasn't his. Without warning, the man turned and locked eyes with John. And then, without hesitation, he lunged at him, a guttural growl escaping his throat. John barely had time to react. He shoved the rifle into the man's chest, pushing him back with all his strength. The man didn't flinch. In fact, he didn't even seem to feel it. The zombie, if that's what it was, kept coming, dragging its foot as it growled, teeth bared. John fired, the sound of the gunshot deafening, but the man didn't stop. It took 3 shots before the man fell to the ground, twitching violently. Even then, he didn't stop moving. His limbs jerked in spasms, but it was clear that he was dead. Or at least, he should have been. John's stomach lurched. His mind raced to process what had just happened. Was this some sort of flu? A virus? He didn't know. All he knew was that these weren't people anymore. They were something else. Something dangerous. He kept walking, not sure what he was looking for. Maybe other survivors. Maybe answers. But there were none to be found. By the time he reached the edge of town, John realized something even more horrifying. There was nowhere to run. The streets were filled with them. The undead, dragging themselves from house to house, attacking anyone who crossed their path. Some were familiar faces, people who had once been his neighbors, his friends, people he had greeted at the store just days before. And now they were monsters. John wasn't the only one who realized this. The town was in full panic mode. People were trying to get out, piling into cars, pushing their way into trucks, and racing down the streets, desperate to escape. But it was already too late. The infection had spread too far. Even as people tried to leave, the roads were being blocked. Everywhere, John saw the same thing. People being pulled from cars, attacked in their yards, screaming in terror as the undead closed in. Briar Creek wasn't just being attacked by zombies. It was being consumed by them. The virus, whatever it was moving faster than anyone could have imagined. It didn't take long for the town's defenses to crumble. The sheriff's office, usually the first line of defense in any small town, was overwhelmed. The police force couldn't even contain the outbreak. The town had been overtaken. Zombies were everywhere, moving through the streets, breaking down doors, dragging people from their homes. It wasn't just a handful of zombies. It was thousands. And it wasn't just in Briar Creek. It was spreading. John could feel it in the air, like a storm cloud of panic, threatening to choke the life out of everything. The virus didn't just spread quickly. It spread in a way that didn't make sense. One person was infected, and within hours, it was as if the entire town had been taken. People who had never even heard of the virus were falling victim to it, turning into the same mindless creatures, driven only by the need to feed. John tried to make sense of it all, but there was no logic to it. No rhyme or reason. People who had been perfectly healthy, perfectly normal, were now part of the nightmare. And it wasn't just the humans that had been affected. There were animals too, wild and domestic. John had seen a dog, once a friendly pet, tearing into a group of people, its teeth sharp and eager, its eyes as wild as the hunger it carried. Briar Creek was no longer a town. It was a battlefield. John didn't know what to do or who to trust. Everyone was fighting for themselves, trying to escape, trying to survive. But the virus was faster. It was everywhere, creeping into every corner, every house, every street. The one thing John knew for certain was that Brier Creek was lost. There was no going back. The world he had known was gone, replaced by something darker, more savage. And all he could do now was survive. But even that seemed impossible. The infection had spread too far, and the undead were everywhere. The world was no longer a safe place. As he stumbled through the wreckage of his town, John's only thought was of the future. Would he survive? Would anyone? The nightmare that had started in Briar Creek was just the beginning. And as he watched the undead shuffle closer, John realized one horrifying truth. John wasn't ready to give up. He refused to accept that this was how it would end. The horror he had witnessed the night before had shaken him to his core. But deep inside, there was a fire that wouldn't die. He wasn't just going to roll over and let the world be consumed by whatever nightmare had descended upon it. No, he would fight. He had to. John grabbed his rifle, which had been hanging in the corner of his living room for years, collecting dust. He checked the magazine, making sure it was full. He wasn't sure how much good it would do, but it was the only weapon he had, and at this point, it was better than nothing. He grabbed a few cans of food from the pantry, some bottled water, and whatever else he could carry. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. The pain in his shoulder, the wound from the bite, gnawed at him with each movement, but he pushed through it. He had no choice. The town was no longer safe. Briar Creek, his home for his entire life, had been swallowed by the nightmare. The streets, which had once been filled with laughter and life, were now desolate, torn apart by the horrors of the undead. John knew that if he was going to survive, he had to get out of there. He had to get away from the madness that was consuming everything. As he walked through the empty streets, his heart pounded in his chest. His footsteps echoed in the silence. There was no sound of life, no hum of cars, no voices calling out to one another. It was the kind of quiet that made the air feel heavy, oppressive. John could feel the weight of it pressing down on him with each step. It was as if the town itself had been swallowed whole by some dark force. The bodies of his neighbors, once familiar faces, now lay scattered throughout the streets. Some were already dead, their lifeless eyes staring up at the sky, their faces frozen in expressions of agony. Others were still moving, dragging themselves along the ground, their limbs stiff and jerky. It was like they were no longer human, their minds lost to whatever sickness had overtaken them. Their faces were twisted, disfigured, their clothes torn and stained with blood. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and John had to fight the urge to gag. He stepped over one body, trying not to look at it, but it was impossible to ignore the grotesque sight of the woman's mouth hanging open in a silent scream. Her skin pale and mottled. Her hand reached out, twitching, and John recoiled, feeling a rush of panic. He forced himself to keep moving, his heart hammering in his chest, his mind racing. John wasn't sure what he was looking for. He didn't know where to go, where to turn, but he knew that if he stayed here, he would die. Everyone was either gone or already infected. There were no answers to be found in Briar Creek. He had to find shelter, a safe place to regroup, to figure out his next move. That's when he saw them. A small group of survivors gathered at the edge of town, huddled together for safety. They were scared, just like him, but they weren't giving up. They were determined to survive. There were 4 of them, all of them looking worn out, their faces etched with fear. But there was something else in their eyes, too. Resilience. A woman, maybe in her 30s, stood in front of the others, holding a rifle, scanning the area for threats. Beside her was an older man, his graying hair wild, his face unshaven. 2 younger men stood nearby, one of them holding a crowbar, the other a baseball bat. They looked like they had been through hell already, and John could see the exhaustion in their eyes. "Hey," John called out cautiously, his voice cracking. The last thing he wanted was to scare them, but he knew he had to take the chance. The woman turned sharply at the sound of his voice, her rifle raised instinctively. Her eyes narrowed as she took him in, assessing him in an instant. John's hand went instinctively to the rifle on his shoulder, ready to defend himself if necessary, but he tried to make himself look as non-threatening as possible. He wasn't here to cause trouble. He just needed help. "I'm John," he said quickly. "I'm not one of them. I'm just..." The woman hesitated for a moment, but then lowered her rifle slightly. "We're not looking for company, but I guess it's better to have more people than fewer," she said, her voice hard but tinged with the kind of weariness that comes with living through a nightmare. "You got food, water, anything?" "We've been scavenging, but it's getting harder to find supplies." John nodded. "I've got some food and water," he said. "I was just trying to find a safe place." The older man, who had been quiet up until now, spoke up. "You came from the town?" he asked, his voice rough. "Is it really bad out there?" John didn't know how to answer that. How could he explain what he had seen? The town was beyond saving. It was a war zone, and everyone who hadn't already been infected was either trying to escape or fighting for their lives. He couldn't find the right words, so he just nodded grimly. "We've got an old farmhouse just outside of town," the woman said. "It's not much, but it's secure for now. If you're looking for shelter, it's the best we've got." John didn't hesitate. He didn't care where it was. As long as it was away from the chaos of Briar Creek, he would take it. He didn't have any other options. "Lead the way," he said, They walked for what felt like hours, moving in silence, staying close to the shadows. John kept his eyes on the road, on the houses, on the dark shapes moving in the distance. It was only when they reached the farmhouse that he allowed himself to relax, just a little. The farmhouse was old, worn down by years of neglect, but it seemed sturdy enough. It sat in the middle of a large field, surrounded by high grass that had long since gone wild. The door creaked as they pushed it open, and John stepped inside, feeling a strange sense of relief. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Inside, they gathered in a small room with a wood stove in the corner. The air was stale, and the scent of mildew clung to the walls, but it was a roof over their heads. John set down his supplies and took a deep breath. He could hear the wind howling outside and the distant sound of something scraping against the walls. The zombies were close. That night, as they sat huddled in the dim light, the door suddenly slammed against its frame. The sound echoed in the small room, and everyone jumped to their feet. The pounding began, rhythmic and relentless, as if the zombies were trying to break in. They didn't stop. The sound of scratching, of gnawing, filled the air, and John knew then that this was just the beginning. Every night after that, the door would shake with the force of the zombies' hunger. The walls, which had once been solid, now felt like they were closing in. The farmhouse was no longer a refuge, it was a prison. And with every passing day, John felt the walls getting closer, tighter, more suffocating. There was no escaping this nightmare. Days dragged on in the farmhouse, and as each one passed, the feeling of hope continued to slip away. The small group that had taken refuge there, John, the woman with the rifle, the two younger men, and the older man, were slowly running out of everything. Food was scarce. Water was running low. Even their ammunition, which they had hoped would be enough to fend off the relentless zombies, was nearly depleted. They couldn't afford to waste a single shot, but at times it seemed like there were too many of them to keep at bay. The farmhouse, once their safe haven, now felt like a trap. A place where the walls closed in tighter with each passing hour. It was a prison they had willingly entered, but now they were desperate to find a way out. John knew they couldn't stay there much longer. The situation was growing worse by the day. There were nights when the pounding on the doors would begin again, as if the undead were growing more determined to break in. The once vibrant world outside the farmhouse now seemed like a distant memory. They had heard nothing from the rest of the world. No sirens, no helicopters, no signs of help. It was just them, fighting for their lives, clinging to survival in a world that had turned its back on them. The worst part was the silence. The quiet that had once been comforting now felt suffocating. There were no sounds of life, no birds chirping, no rustling of leaves in the wind, just the occasional creak of the farmhouse's old wooden beams and the distant, eerie growls of the undead. The world outside had been swallowed whole by darkness. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion that weighed on John. It was the emotional toll. He could see it in the others' eyes. They were all struggling. The fear was there, but it wasn't the same as before. It wasn't just the fear of the zombies anymore. It was the fear of running out of time. They were all too aware that if they stayed where they were, it wouldn't be long before the zombies found a way inside. And if that happened, there wouldn't be any escape. One night, as they sat around the small stove, huddled in the dim light, the woman spoke up. Her voice, rough and tired, broke the silence. "We can't stay here," she said. "It's not safe anymore. We need to get out of here before it's too late." John looked at her, his eyes tired but focused. He knew she was right. They couldn't wait any longer. But where would they go? There were no guarantees, no promises of safety. But there was one place that still lingered in his mind, a place he had heard about when the world still made sense. "There's a military base nearby," John said, his voice steady, though his mind was filled with uncertainty. "Just outside of Briar Creek, if he can make it there, we might stand a chance." The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "A military base? You think they're still there?" John nodded. "It's worth a shot. If they're still alive, if they're still fighting, we might be able to get help." The older man, who had been silent for most of their time together, spoke up. "What if it's already over? What if the base is gone, just like everything else? We've seen what's out there. It's not getting any better." John didn't have an answer for that. He didn't know if the military base would still be standing, or if there would be anyone left to help them. But he also knew that staying at the farmhouse was not an option anymore. They were running out of everything, and if they didn't try to get out now, they would be dead within days. "We don't have a choice," John said. "We either try or we die here. We've got to take the chance." The decision was made. They would leave the farmhouse, but they couldn't risk traveling during the day. The zombies were everywhere, and the sun made it harder to stay hidden. So, they made a plan to move at night. Under the cover of darkness, they would sneak out, trying to avoid the undead at all costs. The group gathered what little supplies they had left, food, water, and whatever weapons they could scrounge up, and prepared to leave the safety of the farmhouse behind. The night was dark and still, the kind of silence that only the dead could bring. The world outside felt unnatural. The wind barely moved, and the moon hid behind thick clouds, leaving them with only the faintest glimpse of the ground beneath their feet. They moved in silence, like shadows, each step calculated and cautious. John led the way, keeping his rifle close and his eyes darting from side to side, always alert for any movement. The road to the military base was long, and John knew it wouldn't be easy. The area surrounding Briar Creek was littered with wrecked cars, abandoned homes, and countless dangers. Zombies were everywhere. Some of them wandered aimlessly, while others were more aggressive, hunting anything that moved. And then there were the sounds, the eerie moans and growls that filled the air, reminding them that the world they once knew was gone, replaced. They walked for miles, moving as quickly and quietly as they could. Every step felt like it could be their last. Each shadow a potential threat. The road was treacherous, with debris scattered everywhere. It was hard to tell whether the wrecked cars on the side of the road had been abandoned by survivors, or if they had been left behind in a desperate attempt to escape. The further they went, the more unsettling the world around them became. The distant groans of zombies grew louder, and John's heart raced with every new sound. He felt like they were being hunted. The tension was unbearable. Every time they stopped to catch their breath, John's mind would race with thoughts of what could be waiting around the corner. Every rustle in the grass, every flicker of movement in the distance made his stomach twist with fear. But they couldn't stop. They couldn't turn back now. They kept moving, closer and closer to the military base, but it seemed like the world was closing in on them. Zombies lurked around every corner. It was impossible to stay hidden for long. As the hours passed, their progress slowed. Their supplies dwindled, and fatigue began to set in. Then, in the distance, they saw it. The military base, or what was left of it. The gates were broken, the fences had been torn apart, and the once pristine walls of the base were now crumbling. It looked like a ghost town, abandoned, overrun, and empty. John's heart sank. It was worse than he had feared. The base had fallen. There was no sign of life. No soldiers. No hope. It was just another reminder that the world they once knew was gone. But even with the base in ruins, John wasn't ready to give up. The group wasn't ready to give up. They had come this far. They couldn't stop now. They had to keep fighting. They had to survive. John and the others reached the military base just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the broken landscape. They had walked for hours, their bodies aching with fatigue, their supplies nearly exhausted. As they approached the perimeter, the sight before them was worse than anything they could have imagined. The gates that had once been a symbol of security and order now hung off their hinges, twisted and broken. The tall fences that once stood as barriers against any threat had been torn down, the wire ripped apart as if by some unstoppable force. Beyond the gates, the base was eerily quiet, its structures shrouded in darkness. John's heart sank as he took in the devastation. This was not the military stronghold he had hoped for. This wasn't even a safe haven. It was a graveyard. The once pristine buildings, the vehicles lined up in neat rows, the tools and weapons that might have been their salvation, were all now abandoned, decayed, and overrun. The ground was littered with wreckage, and the stench of death hung heavy in the air. He could feel it in his bones. There was no hope here. The group hesitated for a moment, their eyes scanning the wreckage, their hearts heavy with dread. But John knew they couldn't afford to stand still. They had come this far. There was no turning back now. They had to push forward, to find something, anything that could help them survive. But the truth was, the real horror had already begun. They moved cautiously through the base, careful not to make a sound. Every step felt like a risk, then another, and another. The zombies were here, and they were closing in. The undead, some of them still in military uniforms, shuffled toward them with a grotesque, stiff gait, their eyes clouded with hunger. It was impossible to tell who these people had been before they had become monsters. Soldier. The first one lunged at them, its mouth open wide, teeth bared. John didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired, the sound of the shot ringing out across the desolate base. The zombie fell, twitching violently, its body jerking as it hit the ground. But the others kept coming. They were everywhere, emerging from the shadows, staggering toward the group with terrifying speed. "Keep moving," John shouted, his voice hoarse with fear. "We can't stop here." They ran, fighting their way through the horde of zombies, each one more brutal than the last. Some of them had been soldiers, once proud and strong, but now they were nothing more than twisted, decaying creatures. Their bodies had been ravaged by the infection, their skin hanging in tatters, their bones exposed in places where their flesh had rotted away. John could see the empty sockets of their eyes, the gaping holes in their faces, where their noses had once been. They looked like nightmares made flesh, reminders of what had happened to the world. One of the younger men, Mike, was the first to fall. He had been moving with them, his crowbar raised, ready to strike, when one of the zombies grabbed him from behind. It was too quick, too strong. Mike struggled, but it was no use. The zombie tore into his flesh, dragging him to the ground. He screamed as the creature bit into his neck, and the sound of his voice, full of terror, echoed in John's ears. But there was no time to save him. There was no time to mourn. They had to keep moving. "Mike!" the other young man, Derek, shouted, reaching out toward him. But John grabbed his arm, pulling him away. "We can't help him," John said urgently. "We've got to go." They ran, their hearts pounding, their feet slipping on the blood-slicked ground. The sound of the zombies chasing them was deafening, their growls and shrieks filling the air. John's mind raced as he tried to calculate their next move. The base was supposed to be their safe place, but now it felt like their tomb. The gates were no longer an escape. The military base had fallen, and with it, any hope they had left. The group stumbled through the base, desperately trying to find a way out, but the zombies were everywhere, blocking their path, surrounding them on all sides. John fired his rifle again, taking down another of the undead soldiers, but there were too many. It was impossible to keep up. The gunshots seemed to only draw more of them, and soon they were trapped. The walls that had once seemed like barriers now felt like cages. And then it happened. The older man, the one who had been so quiet during their journey, fell behind. John turned just in time to see him being grabbed by two zombies, their hands tearing into his flesh. The old man struggled, but his strength was no match for the undead. He screamed, a desperate, agonized sound that filled the air. But it was over in seconds. The zombies ripped into him, pulling him apart. John could barely process what was happening. He had seen death before, but this, it was different. This wasn't just a fight for survival. This was the end of everything. They were losing, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. Their group was falling apart, and the nightmare was consuming them. The remaining survivors, John, the woman, and Barrick, kept moving. They didn't stop, couldn't stop. They couldn't afford to dwell on what they had lost. There was no time for mourning. Not yet. The real horror wasn't just the zombies. It wasn't just the terrifying sight of the undead shambling toward them, hungry for their flesh. The real horror was the feeling of losing everything. John had already lost his town, his home, his family. He had watched as Briar Creek had been consumed by the outbreak, the place he had known for so long turning into a war zone. He had watched as his friends, his neighbors, and now even his companions had been taken from him one by one. It wasn't just the loss of people, it was the loss of hope. The world they had once known was gone, replaced by a nightmare that had no end. They were fighting, not just to survive, but to hold on to whatever was left of who they were. The woman's eyes were filled with the same grim determination, but even she couldn't hide the weariness in her gaze. Derek, the youngest of them all, was barely holding it together. He had seen too much, and John could see the fear in his eyes. But they had no choice. They had to keep moving. They had to keep fighting, or they would become just like the others, another pair of lifeless eyes staring up at the sky. The base, the place they had hoped would be their salvation, had fallen. The gates were broken. The fences were no longer barriers. The undead had taken over, and there was no escaping that truth. The real horror wasn't just the zombies. It was the feeling of losing everything. The world they knew was gone. All that was left was fear, survival, and the knowledge that they were running out of time. John didn't know how much longer they could keep fighting. But one thing was certain. They couldn't stop. Not yet. They had to find a way out of this nightmare. They had to survive. John and the others had found a small shelter in the ruins of the military base, a place that had once been a symbol of hope and strength, but now lay in tatters, like everything else in the world. The building they had taken refuge in was nothing more than a decaying shell, its walls broken, its roof half collapsed. The windows were shattered, and the air inside was thick with dust and the faint scent of decay. The group had managed to push through the wreckage, finding an area where they could rest. But even then, John knew it was only temporary. The walls of their makeshift shelter weren't enough to keep the real danger at bay. Outside, the horde of zombies was drawing nearer, and with every passing hour, it seemed like the odds of survival were slipping further away. A faint sound of shuffling feet could be heard from outside the crumbling walls. It was a haunting sound, one that had become all too familiar in the last few days. Zombies. They were closing in, relentlessly moving toward the shelter, drawn by the scent of the living. John's heart beat faster, the adrenaline starting to surge through his veins. His grip on his rifle tightened. He didn't know how much longer they could last, but they had no choice but to keep fighting. It was their only option now. He turned to face the others. The woman who had been with them from the start was crouched in the corner, checking her ammunition, her eyes filled with a mixture of determination and exhaustion. Derek, the youngest of the group, was sitting against the wall, his face pale, his eyes hollow from the horrors they had all witnessed. John could see the fear in Derek's eyes, the same fear that had been in his own not long ago. The older man, who had once been so quiet, was standing by the door, peering through the cracks in the wall, keeping watch. They all knew what was coming. They could feel it. The zombies were closing in, and it was only a matter of time before the shelter would be overrun. John took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He wasn't sure how long they could hold out, but he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He looked at the group, his eyes meeting theirs. There was no doubt in his mind that they were all thinking the same thing. This was it. The final stand. They had fought through everything up to this point. Through the fall of Briar Creek, through the horror of the undead, through the loss of their friends and loved ones. And now, it had all come down to this. Would they make it out alive? Or would they become just another set of bodies in the growing sea of the undead? Stay focused, John said, his voice steady, though the fear in his chest threatened to overwhelm him. We're not giving up. We fight until the end. We'll make it out of here. We have to. A woman gave him a tight nod, her expression hardening. Derek looked up, his eyes wide, but he didn't say anything. The older man, whose name John still didn't know, simply turned and walked toward the small window, peering out into the darkness. They had made a plan, if they could call it that. Their only hope was to get to the nearby woods, to use the cover of darkness to escape, but they didn't know if the zombies would give them that chance. The creatures were relentless, their numbers growing by the hour, and they had already lost so much. But John wasn't ready to let it all end here. He couldn't. Not when there was still a chance. no matter how small, to survive. As the minutes ticked by, the noise outside grew louder. The sound of the zombies shuffling, groaning, and clawing at the walls echoed through the shelter. John's heart raced, but he kept his breathing steady. They had to wait. They had to be patient. They couldn't act too soon, or they would be caught in the open. Then suddenly, the door to their shelter swammed open. The force of it rattled the walls, and before anyone could react, a zombie burst through the doorway, its arms outstretched, its mouth open in a grotesque snarl. John barely had time to raise his rifle before the creature was upon them. He fired. The shot rang out, the sound of it deafening in the small room. The zombie collapsed, its body twitching as it hit the ground. But there were more, so many more. The woman shouted, raising her rifle and firing at the next zombie that appeared in the doorway. The older man grabbed a nearby piece of debris, swinging it at the next zombie with all his strength. Derek, wide-eyed and panicked, picked up a broken piece of wood, his hands trembling as he tried to fight back. John fired again, taking down another of the undead, but the zombies kept coming. They were pouring in, drawn by the noise, relentless and unstoppable. The fight was brutal. It was chaotic. The room was filled with the sounds of gunfire, the crack of bone against bone, the sickening thud of bodies hitting the floor. John's mind was spinning, his thoughts a blur of survival instincts and fear. He shot again and again, his aim steady despite the chaos. But they were running out of ammunition, and it felt like the zombies were multiplying with each passing moment. The woman fired one last shot, and then her rifle clicked empty. She cursed under her breath, tossing it aside and grabbing a nearby crowbar. She swung it with fury, taking down another zombie as it lunged at her. The older man swung the piece of debris again, but his movements were slower now, more tired. John could feel the exhaustion in his own limbs, the weight of the fight pressing down on him. But he couldn't stop. Not now. He fired one more time, taking out another zombie, but it wasn't enough. The undead kept coming. The room was filling with their bodies, and there was nowhere to go. They were trapped. John's mind raced. They needed to find a way out. They had to get to the woods, to the trees, to the cover they desperately needed. But the path was blocked by the ever-growing horde. There was no way out. And then, in that moment, it hit John. The real horror wasn't just the zombies. It wasn't the constant fight for survival, the terror of each day, or the loss of friends and family. The real horror was the feeling of losing everything. Everything they had known. Their homes, their loved ones, their safety. It was all gone. And they were just left with this, fighting, struggling to stay alive, hoping for a future that seemed less and less possible with each passing moment. But they didn't give up. They couldn't. In the face of it all, John and the others kept fighting, even as their chances grew slimmer. They fought because they had to. because if they stopped, the zombies would win. And so, they pushed forward, taking down as many of the undead as they could, refusing to give in to the despair that threatened to swallow them whole. And then, just when it seemed like all hope was lost, the last zombie fell. It hit the ground with a sickening thud, its body twitching once before finally going still. The room was silent, save for the heavy breathing of the survivors. John stood there, his rifle lowered, his body trembling with exhaustion, his mind numb with the realization of what had just happened. They had done it. They had fought their way through the nightmare, and they had won, but the victory felt hollow. John looked around at the destruction, at the bodies, at the carnage. Briar Creek was gone. His life, everything he had known, was gone. But he was still alive. He was still standing. In that moment, John realized that survival wasn't just about fighting the zombies. It was about fighting to hold on to what was left of their humanity. In a world that had been consumed by darkness, the real battle wasn't against the undead. It was against the fear, the hopelessness, the desire to give up. They had won, not just against the zombies, but against that darkness. And that, for John, was all that mattered now. The end. Or was it?